correct the carbon that's in there. But the one thing we can change, and that is the sulfate, because the sulfate primarily comes from us. So we do have control there. If we have sulfate, and then we have sulfate-reducing bacteria, they're always there. Those bacteria will convert the elemental mercury, which is not the dangerous kind, into the methyl mercury, which is the dangerous kind. And then Sugi did a great job of explaining bioaccumulation and how come it ends up in the fish. I won't go over that. Next slide. In a simplistic view of an unpolluted watershed, you have something like this. So the red would be the sulfate, and the green is mercury, and then the little smiley guys are bacteria. And the sulfate-reducing bacteria can then use that to produce methyl mercury. But notice, there is no methyl mercury being produced. We're down at 2 or 3 milligrams per liter. It doesn't happen. That's the good news. Next slide. Here's the bad news. Today we live with a highly contaminated watershed. We just happen to have industries that have a byproduct of sulfate that's just enormous. Talking about 200 tons per day coming down. We have a huge mining sector that's producing that. We have a paper mill that's producing that. So we have big industries here, and they just happen to have a bad problem with sulfate pollution, and they're dumping it into our watershed. So anyway, when you get enough sulfate in there, all those bacteria are working full speed to methylate mercury. And you can see that the bacteria are shaded blue. They are methylating, and they're producing the bad molecule for us. And that's what we need to prevent. Very quickly, let me wrap this up because time's flying here. After we had our St. Louis River mercury TMDL here in this part of the state, we sort of went into recess while the state was doing theirs. Then we found out that St. Louis wasn't going to be cured of its mercury issue. And so a new mercury TMDL process started up here. And it was well funded to the tune of about $1 million. And models were developed, models were being vetted by that group, and they were acceptable to that group. And then, a couple of years ago, with no warning, the state MPCA, and I hate to say this because some of the folks are here today, but the state MPCA pulled the plug on doing a mercury TMDL for our river. They came up here to defend that decision, and under pretty intense drilling, they gave the reason for pulling the plug that we do not know enough about methylation and demethylation to do a model that could fairly work out a TMDL process to cure this problem. Well, I beg to disagree with them. So we asked them, well, what is there about methylation that you don't know, and demethylation that you don't know, and tell us where the gaps are. Maybe we'll ask Jerry Glass what happens in those gaps. Maybe we'll go to the peer-reviewed literature and find out that yes, there is information about what happens in every beaver dam. There is information about what happens in floodplains. We have enough information to make good management decisions to clean up this river. The political will, that's another story. And I'm not blaming the MPCA scientists that are here tonight. I'm blaming the policymakers in St. Paul. They did not have the political will to face these giant multinational corporations and their lobbyists and their very sympathetic legislators on the Iron Range, and they couldn't do it. So here we are 16 years later. The mercury is as bad as it was in 1998. Our children are being damaged. That's completely unacceptable, probably to every person in the room. The question is, this is your final exam. When we meet again in 16 years, will the mercury in our fish still be damaging our babies? And I think Andrew has a good plan to address that in the last hour of our meeting, a way in which we will do a People's Congress and follow up on it like we didn't do last time. So if you can hang with us that long, we really appreciate you to be around that last hour. Thank you very much.
We've heard from 3 of our brilliant neighbors, and each one of them could have spoken to us for a couple of hours. So, Andrew, are you ready to go? We're going to pass on the questions so that we can move on to the next panel. Guys ready? Otherwise, I'll lose the time. What questions? The questions are going to be incorporated as part of the record, so what you submitted is going to manage be part of what we go to.
So if you're a member of the second panel, please come join us.
I'm going to put them in the light here so we can see them. Well, good evening. My name is Rich Stafford, and I am here with one of the MEP organizations, the Isaac Walton League. Locally here we have the W.J. McCabe chapter, and the Ikes, of course, have been very concerned about healthy fish populations and water quality, actually going all the way back to their origin in the early 1920s. And of course, locally here, we're very concerned about the St. Louis River and Lake Superior, these two really incredible water resources that we have right here in our backyard in Duluth. So this panel, we're very fortunate that sitting in front of you right now, we have representatives from the 4 government agencies that are primarily responsible for managing the pollutant levels in our water. And so we have representatives from the Environmental Protection Agency, from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, from the Wisconsin DNR, and from the Fond du Lac Band of the Lake Superior Chippewa. And what we're going to be asking them is I'm going to be asking them 3 questions, and they'll each have just a few minutes to respond, and they'll each respond to the first question, then we'll do the second question, the third question, and then hopefully we'll have time to open it up to some questions from the audience. So again, if you have some questions that you would like to ask them, fill out those cards and pass them to the center. Let me start by introducing our guests here. We have, I'll start at the federal end. Peter Swenson is the branch chief with the Watershed and Wetlands Branch of the Water Division of Region 5 of the US EPA. And Peter came here all the way from Chicago, so we're really happy that he came. And this is Peter over here. I guess that's easy to figure out. He's the only guy among the group. So. And then we have Shannon Lockhammer is right here in front of me. And Shannon is the director of the Environmental Analysis and Outcomes Division of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and she works down in the St. Paul office. From Wisconsin, we have actually 2 representatives from Wisconsin. One is going to deal with the first question, and the other one is going to deal with the other two questions. So Wisconsin comes in two parts here today. So we have Nancy Larson is the Northern Water Resources leader and with Wisconsin DNR, and Shree Hagan is the Water Resources and Lake Superior Supervisor for the Water Quality Bureau and Water Division of the Wisconsin DNR. And then last we have Nancy Schultz, and Nancy is the Water Projects Coordinator for the Environmental Program of the Fond du Lac Reservation, and she's located works on the reservation right here west of Cloquet. So those are our representatives from the different agencies. Now, let me start with the first question. What we're going to try to find out is what have they been doing to remove mercury from the St. Louis watershed, and then what are they planning to do in the next year, and then we're going to ask them to tell us what can we as citizens and environmental groups do to help them accomplish the job that they're trying to do. And I used to be a government employee, and I know that I think each of these people sitting in front of us want this river cleaned up just as much as we do. But it's an extremely challenging job, and sometimes they have limitations that they have to, well, all the time have limitations in funding and manpower and what they can legally and not legally do. So there are challenges. So the first question is, what is your agency's commitment to reduce mercury contamination of fish in the St. Louis River? Please give an example of actions your agency is currently taking related to the mercury impairment of this river system. And we'll start with Peter with this question.
Thank you, Rich. Can I look? Oh, should I use that?
This might be easy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take the liberty of maybe broadening your question just slightly, because I think it's important since the mercury problem is such a ubiquitous problem across the country and the world, that I mentioned a few things that my program isn't directly involved with them. They aren't targeted toward the St. Louis River necessarily. I think they're worth mentioning in terms of things that EPA, which is obviously a very big agency, has been doing regarding mercury pollution. So, well, one of them that is related to the St. Louis River is, of course, the whole area of concern, the remedial action plan process, which EPA has been involved with since its inception and continues to be involved in. And Scott Sinowski, who some of you may know from my office in Chicago, is EPA's Chicago representative on that. Joel Hoffman, who you may know from the Duluth Lab, is involved in research that includes work on the AOC as well. So EPA has had a strong commitment to that process, as have the other partners that are sitting here tonight, obviously. So that's an important one. Going back a few years, EPA, again with state participation, wholehearted participation, developed something called the Great Lakes Initiative, which set out to set water quality standards for the Great Lakes that were protective and uniform across the Great Lakes. And I wanted to mention that because the 1.3 nanogram per liter mercury limit that is now standard across the Great Lakes comes from that process, which EPA was involved in. Stepping outside the water arena for a minute, I think it's worth mentioning that from the air deposition, which of course is a huge factor in the St. Louis River and elsewhere in terms of mercury pollution, EPA has been involved in a number of initiatives to reduce mercury pollution from air emissions. At one point in time, incinerators were a big source of mercury, both municipal and medical incinerators, and those have been greatly reduced, almost phased out at this point. It's taken a while, but EPA recently finalized its MAX standards, its maximum achievable control technology standards for mercury. Those are now being phased in, and I know that Minnesota beat EPA to that by endpoint by many years, but because a lot of the contributions do come from out of state. We think that's going to be a very helpful addition to the tools that you have here in the St. Louis River. And it requires a 90% control of mercury from power generating facilities. Some facilities have already made progress, but the estimate that I heard recently was that a real reduction from this point on of about 75% is probably a realistic estimate of the effect of that rule when it's fully implemented. The program I represent is the TMDL program. You've heard that term a few times, total maximum daily load. The TMDL program, however, is really a state program. EPA's role is to review and approve those. It's a final agency action when we do. But the states drive that process. We sometimes are able to come up with funding to help them perform it. But the whole structure is set up as the states taking the lead, both in setting their water quality standards, instituting controls to meet those standards under federally delegated programs and also state programs, monitor to be sure, hopefully, that those standards are being met when they're not, to list those as impaired, the term that you heard earlier, meaning that the water quality standards are not yet achieved. And when a water body is impaired, typically that means that the total maximum daily load needs to be developed. A TMDL is a very simple concept, and it can be a very complicated or very simple product. In the case of the statewide TMDL that Minnesota did for mercury, that was a major effort and involved not just the calculation of the mercury budget that would be needed to meet water quality standards, but a whole suite and an ongoing effort to implement activities to actually meet that. And that's going beyond the absolute requirements of the federal TMDL. So anyway, that's EPA's role in all those things, and I think I should turn the microphone to the next person.
You feel me lurking behind you?
I feel you.
Hey, Shannon.
Thank you very much. Again, I'm Shannon Lonhammer with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And while I'm from St. Paul, I actually did go to school up in Duluth, so I have affinity for this area and an affinity for Lake Superior. I have a niece that's going to school in Duluth now, and actually I had the pleasure of having lunch with her today before I came to this forum this evening. But just wanted to let you know what some of my local connections are as well. So as far as our agency's commitment to reducing mercury contamination, the Pollution Control Agency has been committed to reducing mercury contamination of fish in the St. Louis River and in all of the lakes and rivers and streams in Minnesota for more than 2 decades. And we remain committed to this goal. So as a part of that, we've shown leadership and really more than 20 years of leadership, both as an agency and as a state as a whole. All of you have been a part of that, about pushing us and pushing the state of Minnesota towards achieving the reductions that we need to achieve the goal of reducing mercury in our fish. Some examples of that, you've heard about the statewide TMDL. The Pollution Control Agency was actually the first state in the nation to adopt a regional TMDL like our statewide TMDL. And that's really a comprehensive mercury reduction plan. Minnesota was also the first state in the nation to enact laws that address the sale, use, labeling, and disposal of household and business mercury-containing products, and reducing and eliminating the use of mercury in products. That process actually continues. The 2014 legislature actually adopted some additional legislation that the PCA proposed through the administration's process to restrict and phase out the use of mercury in wheel weights and in some other products as well. So those efforts on the product side are also continuing. And as Peter had mentioned, Minnesota's coal-fired utilities are reducing their mercury emissions, and that happens through the legislation that Steve Morse mentioned before. And actually, the coal-fired utilities are on track to achieve a 95% reduction in mercury emissions in 2 years, by 2016, from the 1990 levels. So those are some examples of some very real progress that is occurring and demonstrate the commitment of both the PCA and also the state as a whole to reducing mercury emissions and reducing the amount of mercury that's getting into our water bodies. You've also heard about sulfate this evening, and I think, and its connection to the mercury problem. And I do think that it's important to provide the PCA's perspective on this important topic. So as I just mentioned, Minnesota already has a TMDL that's aimed at reducing the sources of mercury in Minnesota and also relies on reductions in those sources of mercury coming from other states and from national sources as well. And that's to achieve the goal of the reduced concentration of mercury in fish. And we also know well, some believe that there's a simple answer to the question about sulfate's effect on mercury accumulation in fish. And as Len pointed out, there's a lot of complicated pieces that go into it, and we at the PCA just don't believe that there's a simple answer to this problem. Any additional TMDLs that we do will have to demonstrate how reducing another pollutant, whether it's sulfate or another contributor to the mercury methylation effort, how that will result in a further reduction in mercury in the fish. So we need to establish that scientific relationship between other factors that may be driving mercury accumulation in the fish, and then reductions in those factors and how that will result in reduced mercury in our fish. And the science that we need to demonstrate that this connection fully just simply doesn't exist. We don't have the science that we would need to complete a TMDL of that nature. Now that doesn't mean that the Pollution Control Agency is throwing up its hands and walking away and saying, we don't have the science, we can't go farther than we have with the statewide TMDL. We're actually actively collecting data and information to fill in those scientific data gaps so that we can better understand not just how to reduce mercury, but then what is driving the availability of the methylmercury that you heard about, and then the bioaccumulation of that mercury into the fish. We want to solve this problem just like you do, and we need that scientific understanding to be able to do that. In the meantime, we're acting on the information that we have and aggressively working to reduce those emissions of mercury and discharges of mercury into both the St. Louis River watershed and statewide for across Minnesota.
Thank you. Now we'll pass it over to Nancy.
Hi, my name is Nancy Larson. I'm with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and thanks so much for inviting us to participate tonight. We're kind of tag teaming this between Sheree Hagan and myself because until about 2 years ago, I was the local manager dealing with the water issues in this area. I moved on to a broader geography, and Sheree has followed me. She's been working on this for about a year, so we're going to tag team our responses. I started my career with Wisconsin DNR 25 years ago as the St. Louis River Area Concern Coordinator for Wisconsin DNR. So we've been working along with Minnesota, Fond du Lac Tribe, and the local communities for over 25 years, really, on the St. Louis River. And then after that part of my career, I moved into working on the Lake Superior Binational Program. And as part of that work, we were looking at sources of contaminants around Lake Superior, and we looked at mercury in particular, looked at what are the main source categories in this region. And there's three major, if you want to simplify it, three major source categories. One is the mercury that comes from utilities, from coal burning in particular, the mercury that comes from ore processing, and the mercury that comes from products. Now this was work that we did basically 2 decades ago. Things have changed since then to some degree. There's been a lot of progress, like Shannon mentioned, in the products arena in particular, and in utilities. We'll go into that too. But in products, I want to give a shout out to some of the local work that happened there. Because although both states did a lot of work, especially Minnesota, in legislation that helped drive national policy, local people really had a cutting-edge effort there. So the Western Lake Superior Sanitary District and the City of Superior did a lot of community pollution prevention work, a lot of education, and work that really looked at where the sources of mercury come in a community and get into the collection system. So we've seen a lot of progress in that regard because of local leadership. City of Superior won a national award for their work, and Wisconsin DNR contracted with them to develop a manual for all communities in the state of Wisconsin to work with mercury reduction in their communities. So we've made strides in that regard. In the area of utilities, just like Minnesota, in Wisconsin, we had a law passed in the early 2000s that started requirements for reduction of mercury from the large utilities. And so we've seen greater reductions than what was required in the law for those large utilities. And those utilities amounted to about 2,500 pounds per year of mercury. So we've seen some big reductions there. And we're on target to achieve the 90% reductions by 2015. Same baseline as Minnesota, so 1990. We had a big reduction regionally too when a big facility that was a mercury emitter in the state of Wisconsin changed its process. We had a chlor-alkali plant in the middle of the state of Wisconsin that changed its process, and that plant was responsible for almost as much mercury as all the utilities put together. So that was a big reduction. But now when we look locally, we still have problems. We all want to be able to eat the fish safely. We want to have a clean river. But there's some issues that we're trying to address here to figure it out. And in particular, for Wisconsin, because the part of the St. Louis that we share is the estuary, we've been very interested, I personally have been very interested in figuring out